Good afternoon or morning, whatever it happens to be, wherever you are. Thanks for coming. My name is Troy Swanson. I'm the department chair and librarian at Moraine Valley Community College Library, and I'm excited to be here. I've presented at the summit before, and this presentation is sort of an update from where I've been in the past, and in some hopefully other deeper thinking, better thinking. Interestingly, there's been so many great presentations today, and I feel like some of the things I want to talk about offer a theoretical perspective around some of the very practical classroom discussions that have happened in other sessions, especially the session with Jacqueline and Nate from Miami University on the hostile media effect. I think this is some nice connections with that. So, all right, well, let's dive in. So to begin with, I want to give, I think there, all right, sorry. I want to give a couple disclaimers. So first off, my goal here is to talk about disciplines that I'm not a part of. I'm going to pull some ideas from psychology and neuroscience, what the neuroscience people are working on and thinking about. So I promise you 100%, there's things that I've screwed up or misunderstood. So any idea that's here, I hope that if you find it interesting, I hope you go out to other sources and go deeper than where I'm able to go in 45 minutes today. Second off is I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about how brains work, and I'm going to make a lot of gross generalizations, all right? And I guess an assumption that I want to make is that I'm going to talk about neuronormative brains. And the reality is, in real life, those things, there is no neuronormative brain. Every brain is unique, and every brain has its own way that it views the world. And it's impossible to acknowledge all of that uniqueness. But I'm not going down the path of people that might be on the spectrum, or people that may have different types of damage to the brain or those kind of things. And so I just want to acknowledge that up front. My intention isn't to leave people out, but also to try to summarize a lot of research that's out there. So I just want to put those two disclaimers up front right off the bat. So, I kind of framed this, maybe this is a little bit of a kind of a, paper lion kind of situation or something. But all over, there's all kinds of conversations about heuristics and how we make judgments. And if you read enough of this, and starting especially with Thinking Fast and Slow by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, it's a fantastic book, but it's really easy to walk away with the idea that our thinking is broken, our thinking doesn't work, and that we aren't able to be successful with the brains that we have, and we should try to compensate for that in some ways. And sometimes that's true, I guess, but I want to offer kind of a broader perspective. And it's easy to fall into some of this when you see the political divides that we've already talked about in other areas today, right? Like super polarized world, and it seems like from the right and the left, people live on just different planets. And how can that be? Like, is that a dysfunction? And we've seen the outcomes of where some of this thinking may have taken us, right? So I won't delve too far into all of that, but so the question seems logical. Do we have broken brains in our heuristic thinking, our lack of rationality? Are these things that are dysfunctions that should frighten us, and especially those of us in the classroom, if we, are there ways that we can compensate and address that? So I want to get to some of those ideas. But to start with, I thought it might be fun to just ask a few questions and have you consider these questions. Okay, so I'm going to ask them, and I'm going to try to resist my natural urge to explain them, because we're going to come back to them. So you don't have to put your answers in the chat. So just think your answers quietly to yourself and try to remember them, and we'll come back and talk about what these mean in a second. So first off, I want to ask you, who was the 8th president of the United States? So I'm sure all of us have every president memorized, and it's going down the list. You'll know, Washington, Adams, Jefferson. You'll eventually get to number 8. You know who number 8 is, right? Does anyone know who number 8 is? That's a good question. Maybe I should give out prizes if you actually do know number 8. So number 8, of course, is Martin Van Buren. He was, former Secretary of State, leading president. That's, I'm sure everyone's written papers in school on Martin Van Buren, right? Next question, who was your high school English teacher? Now this one, hopefully you remember high school enough that you would know who this is. And I was thinking when I did this of one particular teacher that had a big impact on my life. Mr. McAvoy was his name, and he used to say to me, I was gone, I was sick for one day, and I was like, did you miss me, Mr. McAvoy? And he said, Swanson, I wasn't shooting, but if I was, I wouldn't miss you. Which when I think about that joke, that's a joke. I wasn't shooting, but if I was, I wouldn't miss you. It's probably a joke we wouldn't tell these days in a school setting, but it was a different time. But actually I had 4 different high school teachers that were all fantastic, and I thank them all for putting up with high school me. Think of a city. So that's another question. Any city, whatever comes to you. It could be whatever, maybe somewhere you're going to go. And the interesting thing is that we're going to eventually think about is like, why did you come up with that city? So hold that city in your mind. Let's see next. And then the last question is, should we raise the minimum wage? Yes or no? And you can think about, and the bonus question is, what should the minimum wage be? You can think about what that might be. Should we raise it or not? And I guess I mean the federally mandated minimum wage, but it could be really any minimum wage. It's not really particular for what we're doing here. So with that being said, I wanted to answer page. I just threw money symbols up there for this page. This is nothing. So this probably should say neuroscience and psychology. Let me throw some ideas out there, and then we're going to come back to these questions and fill in and help us think about some of these answers. So an interesting thing with our brains is that we, sorry, let me move some windows out of the way. We cannot access most of the work of our brains, which is probably really a good thing, right? Like if I had to keep track of my breathing right now, I would not really probably be able to do this presentation. If I had to keep track in my conscious mind of monitoring glucose levels in my blood, I probably wouldn't get much work done over my day, right? So there's a lot of things that happen automatically, but even more importantly, with how we think about information, we don't know really how memories get made and how they get stored away into our brain. And when we have to make preferences, especially preferences that are like split second decisions, we often aren't aware of the reasoning that happens behind those choices. And as I mentioned, we don't have access to most of the other functioning that's like the life support system that keeps ourselves alive and going. The neuroscience has pulled a term from artificial intelligence, the hidden layer. And there's a hidden layer that works that we don't have access to. And these are the survival mechanisms. This is unconscious cognition, so decision making that's outside of our control. And really almost all of our memories, and those memories that also become our concepts, that become the schemas that we use to operate. So we will know what we think consciously, but for most of the decisions we make day to day, we do not know why, and we often do not know how we got to the choices that we make and the activity that's happening within our brain, which I think is really interesting and has eventually we'll get to some information literacy implications behind it. Along with that, we often think of the brain, and I'm probably falling into it even just talking about it, as this unified whole, right? It's not a unified whole. Our brains are modular, and our conscious self is only a part, and really a small part often of our brain. Our awareness of what we're thinking, what we're doing is a small part of the overall activities. And so starting with the idea that consciousness is not the entire story, I think is important for us when we think about how we process information. And importantly, when we get to the point of thinking about how students we might be working with are processing the information that our libraries provide. This is a great quote. I don't want to read all of it, but this is from physician Robert Burton. He wrote a brain on the book, and I just loved it. He's talking about how the brain is like a big committee. And I really like the term brain as a democracy, like there's a big vote. But this is just sort of a touch on it. So the idea of the magnitude of this process, imagine billions of committee members. And given that a lot of us are, in public education or higher education, at least, we love committees. So this should be like at home for us. But imagine billions of committee members, each with at least 10,000 hands reaching out to shake hands, prod, poke, seduce, or fend off other members. Miraculously, this orgy of utter chaos is transformed into a relatively seamless and focused stream of consciousness. So his larger point is that when we have to make decisions, when we face our world, there are many brain processes at work. Many of them are intuitive systems that we do not have access to, that are helping us make decisions, that are pushing us in directions. And somehow our brain does a monster survey of all of these different modules, and we get to make a decision. So this morning, when I was going into my closet to try to figure out what I was going to wear to do this presentation, and I have an array of blue shirts that I need to choose from. If I had to do a cost benefit analysis, like which shade of blue is best for today, I would probably still be standing there, but my brain is able to just be like, oh, I haven't worn that one for a while, grab it and go, or whatever, what you're going to eat, any decision that we've made. So I do think that this has some major implications though, right? This idea of the rational conscious brain directing our whole lives gets really undercut and transformed when we think about these processes that happen within our brain. And a key idea is this idea of the feeling of knowing, which I have found like a lightning bolt kind of idea when I read about this and thought about how it would actually work. And this is hit on a lot of different areas in psychology and neuroscience. The feeling of knowing is an internal sense of certainty on a topic. Okay. Sometimes the word felt sense. So a felt sense is where if you think about an idea and you want to evaluate or reflect upon how you feel about it, do you believe in it? You could almost have a bodily feeling around it that pushes you in a direction. So the best way to think about the feeling of knowing is this is like the interface between your conscious mind and all of the unconscious processes are at work. And that when that committee vote happens for your brain to make a decision, the feeling of knowing enters into your body, and it's a summary. It captures the whole experience of the brain. So not just what your conscious self and the rational self happens to think, but all the other pieces that come with it. And sometimes in the education literature, we oversimplify the idea of consciousness and unconscious to saying the rational versus the emotional. And I think that or even like cognitive versus affect, right? I think that really does a disservice for what is actually happening, right? There's a broader, more nuanced kind of thing happening when we make decisions, where it's not just, oh, the emotions color our feelings. Well, yeah, or color our thinking. Yes, that might be true, but there's a broader thing, and there's the way we see the world, understand the world, and it gets summarized in this feeling of knowing. And sometimes the feeling of knowing becomes present when we don't have it. So you face something new, and the feeling of knowing isn't there, and that's where you're like, I don't know if I'm going to make it. That like gut feeling, like I don't know if I'm going to make this decision or not, because I just don't feel right about it, right? So often when we know something, it is a feeling and it is not this logical outcome. So things like values, right versus wrong, they're not this easy thing that we weigh. It is actually a feeling that we have about how we see the world. And I think that is super important. And kind of when I read about this, I was like, this is the thing I've been after and trying to understand as we've been teaching, especially like thinking, evaluating sources, those kind of thing. So just as an example of the reading of knowing, I'm going to read this one to you again. Sorry to be reading so much from my slides, but I think this really matters. So I'm going to read you this paragraph, and I want you to try to think about what this means. And if you have heard this before, don't throw it in the chat and ruin it for everybody. So here we go. A newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it is better to run than to walk. You may even have to try several times. It takes some skill, but it is easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people doing the same thing can also cause problems. One needs lots of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance. So when I read this, is all these, you can read through it. Some of you may know what the answer is. There's one thing that when I say it, everyone will understand what it means. But these all seem like very disconnected things. So the answer to this, of course, do I have I don't have a slide. Okay, I'll tell you. The answer is, this is about a kite, flying a kite. So newspaper is better than magazine. Seashore is a better place to do it. At first, it's better to run than to walk. So all of these refer to how to fly a kite. Now, once I say that, all of this will make sense, right? And this is probably a simple way, but then you will have the idea is to generate a feeling of knowing about this. And then once you reread this, you will never reread this paragraph in the same way, right? It offers a context and a meaning that unifies these things that seem disconnected, but you feel like, and when I say a kite, anyone that's flown a kite, or even if you haven't, you know what that is, you know that's the right answer. There's no math that I need to do to convince you what this paragraph is about, right? So that's just an easy demonstration of the feeling of knowing. And I love, this is another quote, and I'll resist reading all of it, but this is an interview from Charlie Kaufman, who's on Fresh Air last year, and he's really in this talking about fiction, but I think it's true for like really any information. He's talking about reading a piece of fiction, and we often talk about reading something that helps us see the world in new ways. But his note is like the most powerful thing. The thing that I really relate to is when I read something that has articulated something that I have felt, but I haven't been able to articulate. And we see this all the time in our classrooms when students have a feeling, or they have an idea, and they haven't quite coalesced around what the meaning of that idea is, and you find something that exists. That's when the lightning bolt happens. And that's when you're like, oh, this is exactly what I needed. And that's that moment of clarity, that feeling of knowing. Excuse me. That's the powerful moment. And I know, like, if anyone that's done research, when you've been out there and you're exploring a topic, when you hit that lightning bolt moment, it's super powerful. And I think all of us know it's also super dangerous in some ways, which we'll get to some of these implications, because when you find things that make you feel good, when you find things that articulate these hidden feelings that are happening behind the scenes, it doesn't necessarily mean that those things are accurate or useful or good for society. It just means that you're hearing things that connect in, right? And that's where confirmation bias and all those other biases, the heuristics that we worry about, that's where some of them come in, right? Because they're connecting in and grabbing on to our thinking. Okay, so let's go back to these questions. Hey, go back to those answers. So who was the 8th president of the United States? The thing that's interesting to me about this in terms of this discussion is that there's 3 things that really come into play. There's probably a lot more than that, but just in general, is our conscious processing. We're thinking consciously about this in short-term memory, activating our long-term memory. Within our memories, we have ideas about who the president was. And some of you are probably like thinking who is a president, trying to get in your head. And then ultimately there's a feeling of knowing, and that feeling of knowing becomes a judgment. Now, probably most of us didn't know that Martin Van Buren was the 8th president of the United States, which is why I picked it, because he's sort of mostly obscure. If I said the first or the 16th or whatever, there's a few that really stand out, right? But that lack of feeling of knowing becomes a metacognitive cue, right? It's a statement internally, a judgment about the state of our knowledge around this question. So there's probably, out of the people in this room, there's probably, maybe one, if that, who knew who the 8th president of the United States was. But probably most of us were like, I don't quite know who this is, right? And so that feeling of knowing becomes a judgment for us. So high school English teacher, of course, all of us probably could grab that. But the thing that's interesting about this to me, and why I put it in this presentation, is that we can recall this specific memory about our lives, but none of us really understand where that knowledge is stored and how our brain stores it away. Like, our consciousness can access it and can call it forth when I asked you. And up to that point, some of us maybe haven't thought about our high school English teachers for many years, right? And then once I ask you that question, bam, you're able to pull it in. And that's like, again, that hidden layer of how our brain operates that we don't have access to. And even now with fMRI and different work being done in the neuroscience area, it's still not exactly clear. Like, that's still sort of the $1 million question. The hard question is like, how does the brain actually store that away? And what does that look like? Like, we have ideas on how neurons work, but we don't know how systems of neurons actually get us to my high school English teacher, which I think is just unbelievable. It's just fascinating. So a similar thing is, think of a city. Now, you have no idea in really how you came up with the city. Now, you may have good guesses. So some of you may have said, and I say, think of a city, you could say the city that you're in, or maybe the city that you're going to go on vacation to at the end of this semester or whatever. And those are probably good guesses why you thought of a city. But some of you, like maybe someone said, Tokyo or Sydney or whatever, and you would have no idea why your brain chose that out of all the cities. But it's important because that is a vital, quick decision making is absolutely important for our survival, right? Our ancestors that were slow decision makers became lunch for the lions and tigers and whatever, saber-toothed tigers or whatever. They didn't make it into our gene pool. And so our brains have been slowly evolved to be able to do these random split second kind of decisions that we actually don't know how our brains make a lot of this. So again, why did I pick the shirt that I picked in the morning? I don't know. I like this, whatever. I have no idea actually. And even if you have a good guess on why you selected a city, you don't really know for certain, right? And then finally, should we raise the minimum wage? There's no real answer to this, right? This is a 100% judgment. And the thing that's interesting about this, and I've used this with students before, is that this judgment really activates a lot of our own biases and background thinking in who we are, right? So it brings in values. So what is a person worth? What is the responsibility of a job? What's the responsibility of government? What is it like that I have, that I used to work a minimum wage job? Does that matter? Or, my relative or my parents or whoever owned a company that employed people. And I remember how hard they worked, and all of those things have to come together to make a judgment call. And when you get to an answer, so what should the minimum wage be? Should it it's going up right now, but should it be 15? Should it be 20? Should it be 10? When you get to that answer is really often a feeling. You kind of look at it and you're like, that feels about right. But there's no formula that you can get to that gets you to what the minimum wage should be. And there's 1,000 questions, right, that take us down that path that are similar to this. So let's talk about some of the implications around some of this. So I think, and we've had a lot of conversations today connected to this, but I think you cannot get away from the idea, right? And we all know this, that worldview is our default stance. There's no neutral, there's no objective. We have to take our experiences and build our understanding of the world. Our brain runs a simulation of what's happening around us, a judgment, ongoing judgment about our lives based on the experiences that we've had, right? So culture, history, luck of birth, all of it comes into play, and all those societal forces come down on us and help us view the world from where we stand at. We can't get away from it. Importantly, and I mentioned this earlier, right? The feeling of knowing can be wrong. Just because it feels right doesn't mean that it is right. And so this is the source often of our biases. It's also when we make errors, errors in understanding or just unfair preferences. And there's a whole ton of those. And again, when you look at the heuristic thinking, the other studies of like implicit bias, it helps us flesh out where some of that comes from, right? It helps us see that and be reflective on where our feelings come from. But it's also very powerful. And this is, again, I've mentioned some of this. It's also very hard to overcome the feeling of knowledge. And that's also why beliefs, right, perpetuate themselves, is because that feeling is so strong and it's so hard to let go. And that's where, the confirmation bias being number one, and all the related heuristic thinking and biases that are related to confirmation bias, whether, the my side bias kind of things. It's hard to get rid of them, right? So beliefs preserve themselves. It's easy for us to ignore evidence because it feels right. And even to the point where we change how we remember our lives. Like memories are not locked in stone. Every time you activate a memory, there's a potential for changing that memory and updating that memory, which is logical from an evolutionary standpoint. You see memories in new ways. You want to hold on to that memory because it's going to help you stay alive in the future. That's the point of memory, isn't actually to remember the past. The point of memory is to help you not die in the future. And so therefore, when we see memories in new light, those memories can change. But that also then when we think we're these rational computers that have data that we're calling forth, sometimes that's a metaphor we use for the brain, it becomes problematic in a lot of ways and can lead us down into trouble. I just as a side note, I always think, in the library information science realm, sometimes I feel like we think of knowledge as, we're like a book, like we're taking in information and we're putting it on the bookshelves in our brain. And that's not really how neuroscientists don't really even talk about knowledge all that much. We really just have memories, like memories that build up into schemas and generalizations. There is no information. So which I always think is super interesting. So then along with this, then I think it's logical that we should be thinking about, the feelings that we have and being aware of them. So if the feeling of knowing hits us, then we should interrogate that. Where does that come from, right? So this gets us to a metacognitive standpoint and just the importance of reflecting on ourselves. And I've seen some great discussions of this today and some good classroom applications of trying to get students to be reflective of where their viewpoints come from. So can we acknowledge that feeling? First off, can we see that we have the feeling of knowledge? And then second off, can we try to explore, even if we can't totally understand it, can we try to explore where the origins of that knowledge, that feeling comes from, right? And ultimately we have to ask ourselves why. Like, why do we make that decision? How did we get to that point? The where you were born and your worldview is not where you end, right? And I think this is a super important thing to emphasize, that we can broaden our perspectives, that we can recognize our norms that we live by and the problems with that. And then we can try to account for that and be reflective and understand the storytelling that our consciousness wraps around how we see the world. I think this gives us a new vantage point on critical thinking. It's easy to think of critical thinking as, you take a little information and you sprinkle on a little logic and you get critical thinking. And that's often how it's taught sometimes. And I think of critical thinking as this interaction between consciousness and unconscious processing. And can we take our conscious selves and explore that feeling of knowing, that felt sense, and be reflective on where that might come from, right? So critical thinking becomes a new point where to know something and to interact with information also then becomes a reflection back on the self. So metacognition, right, is not just thinking, it is thinking and feeling. So this is from James Zull. This is a great book. It's a little older now, it's like 10 years old, but called From Brain to Mind. If you wanted to look at a good kind of starting point for some of this, it really looks at neuroscience and education, and it's great. So he says we need to know what we think and how we feel about it. And inversely, we must know what we feel and what we think about that. So it's back and forth between thinking and feeling when we interact with knowledge. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, jump through some of this because I've hit it. In the end, right, this reflection, when you think about the self, and we all carry a schema, a self schema of how we see ourselves in the world. And that self schema is built on the theory of mind. So theory of mind helps us understand how other minds work. And also that theory of mind can be pointed inward as we try to understand how our minds work. It's built upon different social emotions. So we have emotions that are connected with other people. Pride, guilt, embarrassment are some of the prime examples, but those emotions help us see how we fit into the groups that we're part of. It helps us define in-group and out-group people. And it hopefully with that social mind, it helps us get to that concept of why. And I think that it's easy for us to underestimate like how important that reflective thinking is. If you take like some of our closest current living species where we share common ancestors. So chimpanzees and like bonobos in particular, we share like 96-97% of our DNA with them. A great example is like you can train a chimpanzee to wash dishes. So you can get the chimp. This is why I have the image on here. Get a chimp to wash dishes in order to get food. And the chimp is happy to wash dishes to get food. That's great, and they can do a good job at it. But the chimp is just as happy to wash clean dishes to get food as the chimp is happy to wash dirty dishes to get food. The chimp doesn't care, and there's no concept there of why they're washing dishes. They're just doing an action to get an outcome, right? And that's a big step. And when it comes to learning, that why question is absolutely important. And even our ability to copy other people, to learn from other people, is it's a key part of education, and it's a key thing that we do quite differently than any other species. So, okay, sorry, I don't want to digress for too long. I do want to say that there is a role for reason and reasoning. So I don't want to throw rationality out the window with all of this. And that's sometimes what happens when we start talking about heuristics and how the different ways that the mind works. And I just want to put out one argument. This is from Sperber and Mercier, talking about how reasoning has evolved. So if our reasoning is so bad, why do we have it? Like, how could we become the dominant species of the world to the point where we're destroying ourselves and the earth along with it. And their argument would be is that reasoning actually works really well, but reasoning just doesn't work the way we think it works often. That reasoning really works at the group level, and that our job as being part of a group is to figure out why everyone else in the group is wrong. We have two jobs, actually. Two jobs is individually, we throw out ideas and we put ideas in, and then we judge the ideas of others. And we're so good at it that we're actually better at judging other people's ideas than we are at judging our own ideas. And we're really good at judging other people's ideas because we don't want to get fooled. We don't want to be suckers, right? And so part of the way reasoning works is that you need lots of ideas. You need trusted people, and that's where some things currently go off the rails, I think. And you need group cohesion so you can make good decisions. You can offer honest ideas and then shoot down the bad ones that are out there. So this is a quick quote from Mercier and Sperber talking about logic and reasoning. They say logic helps simplify and schematize intuitive arguments. So intuitive arguments are the unconscious processing that happens. They're the things that hit us in the gut. So we might feel it, and then we come up with logic after the fact to help us explain it. And then we poke holes in everyone else's logic. And the logic and the rationality becomes a group conversation. So it's not that rationality isn't real. It's just that we're not that good at being rational when we're sitting alone in front of Facebook or Twitter or whatever, right? We're better with trusted people that we work with. So Steven Pinker's book on rationality, by the way, is a good read, even though some of the math that's in it you can probably skip, or at least I did because it was beyond what I needed. But he really emphasizes that we can't get away from rationality. It still has gotten us to the point where we're at, for better or for worse. It's powerful, but again, it doesn't work how we think it does. And so this is my fear is that we hit a point of a skeptical abyss. It's easy to fall into this if we think there is no truth, and I think that's not where we need to get to. I worry that we're in a world of information relativity, and we need to find a way to break out of that. So I'm watching my time. So let's just to close up here, let me talk about information literacy implications from this. So, and I've touched on a lot of this, so I'll try to move through so we have time for a few questions. I think this can help us see evaluating sources, and I've seen this again earlier. I mentioned, we've talked about this today, that to evaluate a source for me, it's just as important to evaluate ourselves as we're evaluating the information that comes to us, right? It has to be a reflective process. We have to know where we stand. We have to be able to ask yourselves why. And if you find a source that has a feeling of knowing, you have to be able to recognize that and try to understand where that comes from. Even when we select a topic, right? It's a broader step back. So if you're selecting a topic for like a research assignment, why did you select that topic? Like, what made you think that topic is important? Like, those are reflective questions because we cannot be neutral. We have to work from our worldview and from our standpoint. So why do you think that's an important thing in the world that you would want to spend time exploring and understanding? And what are the existing beliefs that are locked into us that have led us to this thing that we think is important enough to talk about? This is from Mike Caulfield, who's great. You can look up his work that's out there. But he said we need to notice when emotions happen. So when you're reading an information and a piece of information and you get emotional about it, happy, agreement, or anger, that should be a red flag for you, and you should stop, because that's the feeling of knowing that's hitting you, right? Or disagreement even. And you should take notice of that and try to understand where that comes from. And the real danger is the happiness. When you get information that agrees with you, and that's just going to lock in your pre-existing beliefs, and you get a chance, you miss an opportunity to explore your beliefs and change your mind. So happiness is should be just as concerning to us as the anger that may come when we see other pieces of information. And I feel like that's a thing that we've had some success talking to students about and thinking about where that would be. So it would be nice, ideally, to get to testable ideas. So that this is in the philosophy realm. This is called correspondence theory, where ideas correspond to the external reality, and we can do measurements. That in the way that we justify truth is that we can show that it exists out in the world. But I think, again, if you think about the idea of like the minimum wage idea, right? A lot of the things that are the most important that we find about aren't really just testable. They are value judgments. They are feelings. that we have to make. So rethinking expertise. I think being an expert to me means two key things: that you know lots of stuff, you've studied a topic and you have a broad, deep knowledge on that topic, but also that knowledge gets internalized. The more that you do a thing, the more that you experience a thing, the more that thing moves from conscious processing into unconscious processing, which is logical. That's efficiency, that's survival, right? And so experts don't just know stuff, but they also have kind of a feeling about how the world works. And those feelings help guide to new decisions. Now, again, we can probably name a million examples where experts are wrong, and that feeling of knowing, even in experts, take them down, a bad path or a wrong path. So it's not that this is 100%, but that there's these two things that are at work within people that have deep knowledge on a topic. When we design assignments, and this is where it gets a little trickier, but I think building in opportunities to help students move toward reflection and recognizing that feeling of knowing or lack of can help them. And so selecting topics or having them select topics that are meaningful to them and having them understand why they're meaningful, I think is important, especially as in the early days, and this is where I am at a community college, the first 2 years of a 4-year degree. I think those are foundational times, opportunities to help students be reflective and think about information as they move forward into their higher ed experience. On the information for us as professionals, I think this helps us think differently about threshold concepts and that liminal space that we're in, the in-between when we go from novice into expert. So when we're living in that in-between space, we are really, another way to say it would be, we're establishing a feeling of knowing, a deeper understanding around these things that help us enter a profession or a learning space or a discipline, right? And so I stole this from Lori Townsend et al., our friends who did the first study on threshold concepts. This is their great art. But I think, this is, and I think also some of this helps us rethink like the work of Carol Coulthal, Dervin's work, a lot of work that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years around information literacy, the real theory side. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to connect into what our friends in psychology and neuroscience are doing. So again, we may not know, we may know what we think, but we don't often know why or how we got to it. I think that's an important thing. The question becomes, how can we be more mindful of our intentions? And also, what's the limit? I do think there's a limit in terms of how reflective we can be. We can't totally break out of the traps that we're in, but we have to try our best to try to compensate some of it. So to come back to the beginning, are our minds broken? No, they're not broken. They actually operate very well. But they also don't always operate how we assume. We are not rational data processing computers, and we do fall into traps, and we have to use that to get out. And I just would say, I hope I am just scraping the surface. I'm excited about these ideas. Please come please solve these problems for me and send me the good applications that we can have for all of this. So that is the end of my formal presentation. I'll just say thank you and I'll pause to see if there's any questions. Yeah, so analogies for the brain. Yeah, historically, Stephanie, whatever the newest technology is, that becomes a metaphor for the brain. It's like the steam engine at one point, right? The computer now, artificial intelligence. So yeah, science. Yeah, that's catching up a little bit. So I'll pause if there's other questions. Yeah. So I see a question on neuroplasticity. So there's some amazing things that the brain can do, and I think a lot of or maybe there's famous examples of damage to one part of the brain, and then other parts of the brain compensate. And famously, right, people that lose like one sense, so maybe someone is blind or they lose hearing, the parts of the brain that would operate those other that area, so that's been lost, actually it doesn't just sit dormant, right? It becomes active and becomes heavier processing for the senses that are left. I think that there's some limits. I mean, there's some parts of the brain that are specialized, and there's some parts of the brain that aren't. So when there's a famous book called Guitar Zero, and it's a neuroscientist or maybe psychologist. I can't tell you the author, but you could Google it, where he wanted to disprove the idea that after a certain point you can't learn, right? And he was in his 40s or 50s, and he went and wanted to become a blues guitarist and devoted the time to becoming a blues guitarist to the point where he could play blues improv solos. And he did it. And he talked about his path. And you can do it, like even into advanced age. The most important thing, and they're seeing this more with aging, is to do new things. So like everyone's like, oh, do Sudoku and to keep your brain active. Well, after you've done Sudoku for about a year, you're done. That's it. You got it. You want to do things that make you uncomfortable, that are difficult. Try to pick up a video game and make your brain do new exercise. So when you're learning something, your brain is literally building networks, right? And a lot of that network building is and this is where I get myself in big trouble, by the way. So this is a huge asterisk by it. Librarian talking about neuroscience, red alert. But when they do the fMRI scans on new things, your brain explodes and your brain is super active. But when you get better at it, those brain scans, they don't get bigger, they get more focused, right? And what your brain is actually doing is using a bunch of networks that it doesn't need to use to do this new activity, and figuring out which ones it doesn't. It's like it's whittling down to figure out what it really needs. So it's building new stuff, but by building new stuff, it's throwing out other pieces. And so that to me is like, that's how neuroscientists see learning. They see networks exploding and then networks focusing, which is not really how we think about it, right? So to keep a healthy brain, doing new things that challenge you, that are hard, that don't feel good, that make you uncomfortable, that is your brain at work building up those networks. So I think it's great. So
I think
yeah,
we
Jen.
we have time for one more question, I think. And I think the earlier one came in from Adrian. Do you interface with old school critical thinking instructors, and how do you approach them, or do you?
I got to tell you, I have had the most success with our speech teachers and our writing teachers. And I shouldn't say, and some of it's on me. I say that because I probably could. There's always room for more effort. But I do think that some folks get locked in to how they see critical thinking. And so I think there's room there to work. And I should also say that critical thinking, there is, different meanings around that term. And I don't want to devalue 3,000 years of philosophy that's built up, right? So that's not where I am at all. But I do think there's more flexibility in the subjects that are like the rhetoric side and not the subject side, or disciplinary side, where they're open up to write and talk about anything. I've had some really good successes with some of this, with our speech teachers in particular, talking about trying to get students to be reflective and purposefully picking subjects that activate, their feelings, and getting students to share with each other. I think that community is really important in the classroom. So
technically we do have one more minute. So if you
yeah.
if you want to, in 1 minute, address Janine's question, what suggestions do you have for having a discussion on this with first years or early undergraduates?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even worry so much about the neuroscience-y side of it. I mean, I think it's just getting them to be reflective from the start, that they carry their own biases with. I mean, I think to me, that's like step one, because I should say everyone, that's bad generalization, but it's easy to think that you're the perfectly rational person and everyone else is wrong. And why don't they get it, right? And so getting first to recognize where your viewpoints are. And again, there's been some good applications today that I think would be, the first step. And then you can move down that path. So yeah. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Yay.
It's good to see some friendly faces. Hi, Lori. Okay.
Thanks,
Jen.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, Nicole. Oh, stop recording.